form its state enterprises. The country is looking to move forward as weak global demand continues to drag on economic growth. The announcement came just a week after the Bank for International Settlements said excessive credit growth in the country was signaling an increasing risk for a banking crisis. And for more insight on that, I spoke to Steve Keen, professor of economics at Kingston University. I first asked him how fearful he is that the China debt bubble could actually burst. Here's what he had to say.
I'm totally on side with the Bank of International Settlements on this. They're the only international institution that understands capitalism properly and is looking at the right data and making the right sort of analysis. So that particular work they've done to look at the trend in private debt and then look at the gap between the trend and the current level, which identifies that China's running at 30% above the gap when they regard anything over 10% as a serious warning for a crisis. That's a very strong indicator that China's going to have a serious credit slowdown, and my own work, which uses a different metric, completely concurs with them. So they're quite right. China will face a credit crisis. Now, of course, what China can do that the capitalist nations of the West can't do is instantly shift over to government spending to continue stimulating the economy, which I think they will do. But the scale that they need to do it at, I think, is probably even beyond what China can manage to do. So they will have to have a slowdown, and that'll, of course, affect demand in the rest of the world.
Right. It seems no matter which way they go, a slowdown is in the cards. And it's the rate, of course, at which China has taken on all of its debt that has people like you and me very concerned. I mean, we're talking, 8 years ago, debt was at 147% of GDP, and then by the end of 2015, that number jumps to 255%. And the question is what China really has to show for it. I mean, can we say that all that debt has at least helped grow the economy?
Well, I mean, they've built more apartments than they'll need for something like 15 to 20 years. So there's no, that particular, you could easily house virtually every person in China in a high-rise now. Apparently, you can actually give every Chinese person, like 1.4 billion of them, something like about 5 square metres of office space, with the offices have been built. So there's no more need for construction in China for something like about 10 to 15 years. Of course, at the same time, they do need a large amount of infrastructure. So some of the high-speed rail that's being constructed, some of the power station work that's being done. Most importantly for China, an enormous effort to reduce the level of air pollution in particular. Those are all necessary activities which, if they were financed by government money, would actually do something beneficial. So they do have capacity there. And the thing I think they most should be addressing themselves now is reversing the incredible level of air pollution that they have to tolerate right now out of their industrialisation program. So there are some things they can do which are worthwhile with that government money. Whether they'll do it, we have to wait and see.
Right. Given what many would argue is an integral government role in the economy, some economists have played down this idea of a banking crisis altogether. Their view is that when corporate debt default does become an issue, the government will simply, step in and bail everyone out. Do you buy that argument at all? And if that were to happen, would that solve the problem?
Well, it would certainly attenuate the problem. A major thing I've been arguing now for the last almost a decade is we need a modern debt jubilee, using the state's capacity to cancel private debts and then getting the debt burden off the economy, that doesn't change the malinvestment that's occurred. There's still going to be far too many high-rises and no reason for China to import steel or concrete to build high-rises for the next 1.5 to 2 decades. So that is still an overhang there, but the credit damage could be undone. But at the same time, the people who owe the debt aren't necessarily the ones who will get an injection from the Chinese government. They don't necessarily want to bail out the property speculators, for example, who've built all those towers, but they do want to provide finance for the large-scale infrastructure and for the housing sector, for the households rather than buying housing, of course. So there are ways they can address it, but they still can't avoid large numbers of capitalist firms in China going bankrupt because they got overextended on credit during the bubble, and they are going to fail. So there is going to have to be chaos out of this because the economy is not homogenous, even China. There will be elements which fail even with the government rescue.
And what other problem countries are you looking at these days? You mentioned that you've been tracking a number of countries. You recently tweeted that Malaysia is one of the countries that you have flagged for a potential debt crisis. A lot of headlines as of late within the housing sector, the lending sector. I mean, What are you looking at as a potential trigger?
Well, the potential trigger is simply the level of private debt. Anything above 1.5 times GDP is enough to put you in the range where changes in credit have a large impact on your demand. Secondly, if your credit demand exceeds 10% of GDP, you're in danger territory again, because simply the stabilisation of that rate of growth of credit so that it grows at the same rate of GDP will mean a fall in total demand in those economies. The most vulnerable economy apart from China on that front appears to be, of all things, Ireland again. They've got themselves back in this situation, but that may involve their dodgy accounting and their dodgy tax records. But certainly Canada. Canada is the Western developed economy that I think is most exposed to a credit crisis, and indeed, using a different metric, that's the country that the BIS also identifies as the most likely one to face a credit crunch. Now, what worries me, of course, is when that credit crunch occurs, the political opponents to Trudeau will blame it on his deficit spending. But his deficit spending is one thing that's attenuating how bad that shock is going to be. So Canada definitely, Australia, Sweden, Norway, possibly Switzerland. There's about, as I said, about 17 countries. It'll take me a while to rattle them all off, but those are the major ones.
Yeah.
And sorry, South Korea. South Korea is very heavily exposed.